new friend.
Hello, everyone. It's so good to be with you today. It's been too long. As most of you know, I served as one of your pastors here at Westside for over 11 years, stepping away in early 2018. I have so many memories in the old curling rink. All the changes and the challenges, of course, but mostly I remember the people, the faces, all the many friends we have in this community. So I want to thank you, David, for inviting me back today. And I'd like to say this. I never wanted to leave you. I really didn't, despite what some of you might have thought or even heard. Publicly, I called the change a necessary ending, words I borrowed from a Henry Cloud book. Changes were necessary at the time, but the understanding was always that we would continue to be here with you, teaching, serving. But then, to say it rather ambiguously, things happened, and so we were separated. And I'm sorry about that. But now things are different. When David extended the invitation to come back and teach on a Sunday, I knew right away what I would do. I want to bring a blessing. In some ways, I don't think it really matters what is said in a moment like this. It just matters that we see each other, greet each other, and bless each other as old friends. Actually, what I'm going to say, I have said to you in the past. I love what the theologian Thomas Oden said when he wanted the epitaph on his gravestone to read, "He said nothing new." I love that line. He wanted to repeat the old things, the good things. So I would like to remind us of the blessing we live under. So that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to say the same things I've already said to you, but perhaps they're going to sound different in this moment. What I want to do is to give focus and content to the blessing we live under. I want to take note of how God is good to us. And it turns out, as we will see, that this is how we can be good for the world and for each other. Because the goodness of God that we receive is the goodness we give away. So here is the text, what is often called the Aaronic Blessing, and it's found in Numbers chapter 6, verses 22 to 27. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell Aaron and his sons, this is how you are to bless the Israelites. Say to them, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. So they will put my name on the Israelites and I will bless them." That's a beautiful text. And the first thing we have to do is just to let those words wash over us. But then I think we need to let them take root in ourselves, let them settle into our souls. And I've done this for a long time. I've lived with this text for years. And maybe you could hold on to these words for a while. I think as we hold on to them, we begin to see an extraordinary possibility, what I want to call a way of being. You know, Paul says to the Christians in Rome, "Bless and do not curse." What a line. Bless and do not curse. That's a revolutionary idea. Okay, so it's time for a book. George Bernanos wrote a novel called The Diary of a Country Priest in 1936. And for you literary buffs, it's one of the great French novels of the 20th century. Let me give you a warning here. It's slow moving. It's rather subtle. There's no explosions or car chases, just so you know. But what is it about? It's the fictional journal of a young priest in a small French village. He is poor, he's often sick, and he finds himself serving a resistant and rather troubled flock. So he has his struggles. He's no great success, but he is faithful to his calling as a priest to bless and not curse. Maybe the biggest challenge he faces is not from the irreligious, but from those we might call the religious idealists, those who love their image of the church more than what the church actually is. I heard David make this point last week. You know, to underline this point in the novel, an older priest tells him a story. He says, "I once knew a nun who left the nunnery. She got it into her head that she would now clean the church and make it sparkle. So she got rid of the cobwebs, she removed the grime, she succeeded in cleaning the church and the place looked amazing. That is, until Sunday came and all the unwashed traipsed in the dirt of the world. So she found out her work was never done. And the old priest said to the younger priest, but this was her vision of what church was supposed to be, this beautiful, shiny place. And then the old priest said that she worked so hard at her ideal that she in fact killed herself in the process. So now let me quote him directly from the novel. He says this, the mistake she made wasn't to fight dirt, sure enough, but to try to do away with it altogether, as if that were possible. A parish is bound to be dirty, which all goes to prove that the church needs a sound housewife, sound and sensible. My nun wasn't a real housewife. A real housewife knows her home isn't a shrine. Those are just poets' dreams. From George Bernanos, The Diary of a Country Priest. Now, in contrast to the nun, the young priest has no illusions about his work. He pursues no shiny image. He expects no big success, really. He himself is weak and often sick. And he knows that the village he serves is like every other place. It's filled with people who struggle, who have troubles. And he's utterly realistic about all this. But here's the really beautiful thing in the novel about this priest. He carries this vision that moves past human perfection. His vision actually is not a vision of the people. It's a vision of God, the God of all goodness who is for us. And the novel puts it this way. Why does our earliest childhood always seem so soft and full of light? A kid's got plenty of troubles like everyone else, but he's really so very helpless, quite unarmed against pain and illness. But that very sense of powerlessness is the mainspring of the child's joy. He just leaves it all to his mother, you see. Past, present, future. His whole life is caught up in one look. And that look is a smile. It's an extraordinary quote. Above human weakness, including his own, more profound than human failure, there is this grace and a smile. So let me shift and talk about faces for a while. You know, living as a pastor for most of my life, for over 36 years, I watched faces, and I've watched souls as I think they are revealed in eyes and mouths and all the shapes that faces make. So I think I've seen pain, and I've seen confusion, and I've seen pride, and I've seen cynicism, and I've seen sorrow all on the face. And I've also seen sparks of joy and hope, and I've seen real love, and I think I've seen worship on the face. You know, I think perhaps more than any other place we can look in the world, it's the human face that's key to our knowing about life. It's on the face that we figure out where and whether we belong, whether we are loved or wanted, how we can connect, how we can communicate. We look for clues and cues on human faces, the faces around us. David Brooks, in his book, The Social Animal, tells us that the baby at its mother's breast is not only feeding, she's also watching. A child's deep sense of itself comes through, and this is profound, a child's deep sense of itself comes through gazing at the face of its mother. What an extraordinary thing. Researchers have actually conducted what they call the still face experiment. They ask a mother to take on a sort of blank face with their child, a kind of frozen expression. And babies find this incredibly troubling. They will cry and they'll fuss. And Brooks tells us that a baby will try to win back the expressive face of their mother. And if they don't, they become passive and withdrawn. So I think it goes to the point that we interpret the world through the faces we watch. You know, along this line, we've come to find out that the brain actually carries a special ability for face recognition, with an area of the brain devoted solely to facial recognition. But for some, we are learning now, the ability to recognize faces gets broken somehow. There's a neurological condition called prosopagnosia, which is a fancy word for saying literally face blindness. And what that means is a person can recognize a face as a face, but they don't see it as a person they might know. Strange. So they will see a nose, they'll see eyebrows, they'll see the shape of the jaw, and they'll recognize that they are seeing a face. But it's a generic face. It's not someone they know. It's not Mary or it's not John. Strange condition. Oliver Sacks is a neurologist, now passed, who wrote about such strange conditions like this. And he said he himself had this problem. He said he visits his doctor in the office. The doctor he has known for years. And then when he sees him in the lobby of that same building, he doesn't recognize him. We human beings, I think, have a strange spiritual condition. I think we can fail to recognize the face of God. We can fail to recognize his kindness and gracious disposition towards us, his blessing, because we have some kind of spiritual prosopagnosia. So we might see the various details of life which point towards God's goodness. Maybe a grace here or there, or a moment of peace, a provision, a friend who comes along. And get this, even a gracious correction that saves us from our worst self. All these things might happen, but we can't seem to put it together and see that this is God's face for us, God's personal presence in our lives. We have a hard time discerning the face of God. But the blessing I read earlier tells us something, doesn't it? It tells us that the goodness of God is mediated through, first of all, we have to notice it, through priests. This was instruction for the priests of Israel. And priests were persons who are to represent the goodness of God, the blessing of God by their presence, to stand in between the God who is unseen and us as people and persons. So in some sense, you could say the blessing of God was not only to be spoken by word, but was meant to show on their faces. As the priest says these words, "The Lord bless you," they are to show it on their face at the same time so that their presence or face was in sync with their words. Now, when I say a priest, I don't necessarily mean a man in a long black frock. A priest can be anyone who represents the true heart of God for us. I think we might be surprised who might act as a priest for us. You know, when I was a young pastor in a small town, still in my 20s, there was this elderly woman in my church by the name of Valerie Austin, and she did this for me. She was married to Ole Austin. They're both passed, so I'm going to talk about them. Ole was almost always mad at me. He would just scowl at me for some reason. He was mad at everyone. But Valerie loved me and prayed for me, and her face showed it. And I could tell you stories about how she blessed me. But as a young pastor, I would look at her as I preached and she would glow. You know, I think what a priest does is to remind us that God is with us. They become this tangible, visible presence of God, a human face who somehow reflects the hidden presence of grace. Now, this text tells us that we can learn how to do this. The Aaronic Blessing, and as we've read it, is basic instruction. Here is how we can learn to get in sync with God in word and face. And these words are not only to be spoken, but we notice, and I'm going to rehearse it now for you, the prominence of the face in these blessings. So let me conclude just with a few thoughts of how God is good to us. First, the Lord bless you and keep you. We start with the most basic of blessings, God's keeping, his preserving work in our lives. You know, I've told you all my stories, I think, and I've told you this story in the past, that I once drove off the road going about 60 miles an hour. That's 100K for us Canadians. I drove straight into a grassy median on I-94 somewhere in Illinois. I was in my early 20s. You know, I'm driving along and then I fell asleep and down into the median, boom, 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 boom. My friends were in the car. We were returning home from university. They were sleeping, and then I fell asleep and I drove off the road. And in the grace of God, I drove into a nice smooth patch in the median which still amazes me. You know, I think sometimes he leads me into green pastures. That's what happened. But I was never so awake then. All of a sudden, I'm falling asleep, and then I drive into the median, and now I am awake like I've never been awake in all my life. But every time I think of that story, I think of the vulnerability that I had in the moment and the grace of preservation for myself. We might never have met if it was otherwise. You know, in my life as a pastor, I have met so many people who become vulnerable in life, who suddenly run off the road, as it were. Vulnerability shows up in our lives. And when this happens, people are not sure they can hang on to God. And I often quote this text to them out of Isaiah: a bruised reed he will not break, a smoldering wick he will not put out. Those are pictures of fragility, of vulnerability. And I like to remind people of the gentleness of God in the weakest of our conditions. And I often tell them this illustration. I say, picture yourself as a child walking with your mom or dad through a very crowded place. You know, this illustration came to me as a young dad as I was walking with my children Christmas shopping. And if you picture yourself in this way, that your parent has your hand and people are pushing and shoving, and you yourself are holding on for all you're worth. But I think the really key insight to ask right here is, who is holding on to who? You know, over and over, I have done the simplest thing I can think of it when I've met people in vulnerable places. I pray for God's keeping, the blessing and the goodness of God's keeping. Now, there are people who are not aware of their vulnerability because life hasn't showed them that yet. But one day when they run off the road and they become fully awake, they realize something. They need the blessing of God's keeping. And maybe you will be there to say it to them: the Lord keep you. I feel like in some sense I am here today to say this to you, Westside. The Lord keep you. The second blessing: the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Most of the time, I think when we say the word grace, we are thinking of God's acceptance or forgiveness, which is true, of course. Although I think it's better to say that the grace of God towards us is his total act of goodness for everything we need. We literally swim in grace. Dallas Willard said that Christians burn grace like a 747 burns fuel on takeoff. I love that line. But that said, if we narrow grace to our acceptance with God or his forgiveness, say, there's something here in this blessing that's incredibly surprising. It's an extra ingredient we might not have expected. I wonder if you see it. This grace we live in, this gracious God who acts towards us, does not show us a begrudging face, like, sure, God will have mercy on us, but we'll hear a big sigh when we get it. Or like, Bob, you again? What now? No, never. God delights in our need of him, and as we run into the arms of our gracious God, we experience the blessing of what? A shining face, which means that grace wears a smile. When I was about 20, I think, somewhere around there, I headed the wrong way down a one-way street in Toronto. And just as I realized what I was doing, a cop appeared. Of course he did, right? And he motioned me over. And I'm thinking, I am really cooked. I have no extra money for traffic tickets. And the cop walks up to the car smiling. And he says, "You're going the wrong way, son." And I say, "I just realized that, sir." And I'm thinking, why is he smiling? And he says, "Turn around, son, and go the other way." Okay? And I say, "Absolutely, sir. No ticket?" He says, "No ticket. Have a good day." I think that day on that one-way street in Toronto, I experienced the surprise of the gospel. First, I graciously got turned around. You know, it's dangerous to go the wrong way down one-way streets. I think in some ways I've done better at that. And don't forget that correction is a grace. We should never forget that. And then I was graciously let go of my penalty. Now, I'm not saying this is going to happen to you unless you're a preacher who needs a sermon illustration, so don't count on this. But here's the biggest surprise of all. The cop smiled as he waved me on. Well, I remember it as a gesture of some sort. It may have been an impatient smirk, but I'm going to interpret it as a smile. It was God's smile to me. You know, this is really the heart of the gospel. That at the moment we are stopped in our failures or confronted by our wrong-headedness and wrong waywardness, at that very moment we encounter, surprisingly, a smiling face. God is not a begrudging smirk. No, God in his grace is a shining face. They say you can't fake a smile. They say it somehow shows in the corner of your eyes. Even in our present moment of having to wear masks, we can tell when people smile. You know, so this smiling God is not fake. This is deep down real and good. You know, I think I would say this to you. If at any moment this week you are out and about and you remember this phrase, the face shining acceptance of God, look for someone to smile at. They might not quite know that you were smiling under your mask, but they might notice the corners of your eyes. And anyway, you'll enjoy the moment. And finally, the last part of the blessing. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. Note that there's a real action here. A gift. This action is so rich in meaning. The Lord turns his face towards us, which means we have God's attention. Not only does his face shine upon us, but now he turns towards us so that we have his full gaze upon us and we are given something. Remember back when we used to read newspapers? I don't know if you remember those days. I was reading the paper and my oldest daughter Marnie was about 4 and she was trying to get me to notice her for something she was doing. She was saying, "Watch, Dad, watch this." And I was saying something like behind my paper as I'm reading it, "Wow, that's great." But I really wasn't watching her. And she knew it. And all of a sudden she came up and whacked the paper out of my hands and put her face in mine right in front of me and said, "Watch me, Dad." And I said, "Okay, I'm watching. You've got my attention." You know, it's fair to say that to be noticed is to be given value. People are dehumanized when they aren't seen. This is what happens in city life or in the big crowd. Here's what you can do if no one sees you. Drive out on a country road in rural Alberta or especially Saskatchewan. Because if you drive on a country road, someone is likely to wave at you. That's almost a country obligation. It's almost like, hey, there's a person, I'll wave at them. You know, it's a profound human need to be seen. When people are ignored, they die a little. It breeds a kind of hopelessness. There's this remarkable story in the book of Acts that I've always loved that shows us how this works. A man is a beggar and he sits and waits and begs in a prominent place, and every day people walk by him. And one day Peter and John come by. And again, as usual, he asks for help. But this time something is different. Let me quote the text directly from Acts chapter 3, verses 4 and 5. It says there that Peter looked straight at him, as did John. Isn't that an interesting comment? Then Peter said, "Look at us." So the man gave them his attention, expecting to get something from them. It's a simple observation. You know, a great grace is about to come into this poor man's life. He's about to be healed. But notice how this gift comes about. It comes about when he is seen. And when he is seen, his expectations rise. And perhaps, you know, this is what we can do, even as we've experienced that for ourselves. Perhaps it is a face like yours or mine that can change a person's expectations in life. Perhaps our role is simply to be a face, a priest of the face of God, a face that reflects the smile of God. It's so good to be with you today, Westside. You know, I've got to say, it's been 4 years. I'm about to turn 63 in February, and I can't believe that. But I want to tell you that I'm still learning about the wonder of the goodness of God. I'm finishing up a second master's degree in the coming year, so I'm still at it, learning. But learning is way more than academics, isn't it? I'm still learning about the ways of God, where goodness is, and how much we all need goodness. And I keep learning that I experience goodness as I give it away. You know, there are three primary offices in Old Testament Israel, three primary ways of being in service of the people of God. There was prophet, and there was the priest, and there was the king. I think in some ways I've had all three jobs in my life. I have been a king in some sense, the boss of the operation. I have been a prophet, the person with the words. But you know, at this point in my life, I think I'm fully embracing the simple joy of a priestly ministry, which means that I can reflect in my person and face the goodness of God. My job now is to look at people, to listen to them, and to smile God's smile back at them. So Westside King's Church, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace.